All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Kate Kemper. I am the Assistant Director for Student Engagement in the Center for Service Learning at the University of Kansas. We are here today to talk about KU's student voting rates and trends based on some 2020 data that we recently received from the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, which is a project hosted by Tufts University's Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. This is number 9 of our Educate and Act event series that we started in the spring of 2020. So the goal of this series is really to feature opportunities to learn about engagement and democracy in the US, offering different pieces of information and resources about civic participation from campus, community, and national partners. So that is really what we are doing here today. There will be time for questions throughout. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat and I will kind of grab those, and we'll have time for questions throughout. And at the end, once our friends from IDHE have completed their presentation and have answered questions, we'll also move into kind of a brainstorming space where we can talk a little bit more about how our faculty, staff, students, and community members can support this work moving forward into the 2022 midterm elections. So with that, I will hand it over to our friends at IDHE. Feel free to share your screen, and we'll get started with their presentation about NSLVE.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today. My name is Trinh. I'm the program administrator for NSLVE, and I'm joined by my colleague Prabhat here today. And Prabhat will tag team the presentation a little bit. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop in a chat, or I don't know if we're small enough to, if you want to raise your hand or something, and we'll try to answer your questions as you go along. Prabhat, do you want to go on to the next slides? Thank you. So as Kate mentioned, we are the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education of Tufts University, which run the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. So in addition to the big voting study that most of you are familiar with, we offer other resources to college campuses. And at IDHE, what we do is we work on improving college students' voting, campus conditions for political learning, political equity, political discourse, and classroom teaching for democracy. So if you haven't been to our website yet, we'll put in a chat for you, and you can go in there and look at all the resources that we have in addition to this big voting study that we have. Next slide. Thank you. And at IDHE, we envision a democracy that is participatory. So we want everyone to be involved in this system that we have, that is equitable and representational, that educated and informed, and effectively governed. Next. Thank you. So going into the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. So we have been around since around 2012. And this was started by our director, Nancy Thomas. Some of you might have seen her presented the study for or speak at conferences and workshops. So we are higher education's only objective measure of college students' civic engagement. And this is a free service to campuses. So it is not a study that campuses are automatically opted in. So you do have to sign up to be part of the study. So currently we have about 1,200 institutions in our study, and we provide data from federal elections dating back to 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018, and 2020. And currently we have about 10 million plus college students records for each election, and is represented by 50 states plus the DC area. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this is our newly created, generated NSLVE report. So we'll go a little bit more into KU's NSLVE report, but this is kind of what it looks like on the surface. Prabhat, do you have anything to add, or do you want to take over KU's data?
Yeah, now I think I'll maybe take some time to actually look at the data with you all and sort of highlight some of the trends that you might have already seen, but we felt like it was noteworthy to bring it up for discussion and conversation today. So as my colleague Yui said, my name is Prabhat Gautam. I'm the data manager for NSLVE. I sort of work with the raw data set that comes from institutions to our research center and provide you with these tailored campus reports. You and I have done this a couple of times, so we'll kind of go back and forth, but I will hand it back to Yui for talking about additional resources once I go into the data trends a little bit more. And please feel free to stop me along the way and ask any questions. I'm going to quickly tell you just how we construct this data set. So as Yui was saying earlier, it's an opt-in study. So once your institution decides to participate, we work with National Student Clearinghouse, which is a repository of college student enrollment records, to marry this student records that, for example, from KU with publicly available voter file. We work with a vendor called L2 Political. We, as researchers at IDHE, do not have access to any personally identifiable information. We actually work in partnership with the clearinghouse to anonymize all the information and only receive anonymous records, which give us indication on whether or not the student voted, and nothing along the lines of which particular party the student voted for. Right now, the vendor setup is that we only receive data for federal elections. So as you were saying earlier, we have data for 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018, and recently 2020. So the snapshot that we're giving you is a snapshot of these federal elections and do not at all reflect what happens at the local and state level, which we know KU students and the institution as a whole are very involved and engaged in. So we want you to keep that in mind when you're looking at these trends too. Let's go to the next slide. So overall, at the national level, what kind of picture did we see in 2020? Our director likes to say that the trend we saw was nothing short of stunning. That's like her expression for this. We had tremendously high voting rates and a big jump from 52% in 2016 to 66% in 2020. There are three metrics that we look at in particular. So one is voting, obviously indicating how students vote. The other one's registration, so the rate of students who are registered at the time of the election. And the other one we call it as yield, which is basically of those students who registered, what percentage turned out to vote. And we think these three metrics are really important to assess your college student engagement. While voting tells you about the behavior on the election day, registration leading up to the election day, yield actually tells you a combination of that, an intersection of that. So of all the students that you got on the registration rolls, what percent actually ended up voting on that election day. So you want to think about college student engagement on those three metrics, but really big jumps across these entire three rates that we saw at the national level. Why the bounce? So I'll go a little bit into KU's data because I think you guys would be more interested in what we think is the reason for some of these bounces. Our national report, I think we were saying we'll post some resources along the tab, so we'll add a link to the national report as well, where you can explore some of these questions around why we are seeing such a large increase in voting registration and yield rates in 2020. But I'll take us into sort of KU's data a little bit. This is sort of the cover page of the report that we sent you in October, late October 2021. The report itself includes data for 2016, 2018, and 2020, while we give you the change comparison between 2016 and 2020. We also trying to give you some data for 2018 to look forward to 2022 election as well, so we wanted to send that along in the one report. So this is our kind of a key. I'm going to turn my these are on. So this is kind of our key data page where we give you these three metrics that I was describing earlier that describe different student behavior across that time span leading up to an election. Here we see your voting rate in 2020 was 71%, which was an increase of around close to 20 points from 2016. Noteworthy to highlight is the overall voting rate in the country was 66%. So as you can see with this little diamond here, you guys definitely performed above average compared to the entire national picture. Looking back across these three metrics, we see that you used to always perform above average for some metrics like registration, and that momentum has still been maintained. But things like yield, for example, this is what this middle graphic here gives. In 2016, you were slightly below the national average, but in 2020, you're above the national average there too. So there's definitely a momentum that we're seeing. I think we see that that happened in 2018 as well. So there was some kind of momentum from 2018 that was there. 2020 just kind of pushed it up further. So these diamonds over here give you the national picture, and we're trying to present something here as a vessel chart to indicate that this voting vessel that you're filling, as you can see, 71%, but there's still room to fill this vessel higher. So that's what this kind of chart is showing, is the 29% of your students who are non-voters. But the picture is very different when you look at something like of those students who actually registered, 82% of your students actually voted. So that non-voting eligible registered student is pretty low. So that's something to sort of keep in mind as you look at these metrics. I'll go to this page a little bit. So sort of the momentum that I was talking about earlier, we're seeing this actually when you compare yourself across the rest of the pack in some sense. So when you look at other PhD granting institutions, we saw that in 2016, you were voting at 51%, which was slightly lower than 54% in comparison. You have again sort of kind of gone to the front of the pack in some respect. Here voting at 71%, and that momentum started in 2018 for you actually, and you can see that happening actually across both private institution PhD granting institutions and public PhD granting institutions. So really good news in terms of comparing KU to these institutional groups. We give you a picture of what the overall landscape is like here. So the highest voting rate in 2020 was 89%. So knowing that you're 71%, I think is a good way to assess what the spread is like. And the lowest voting rate was 19%. So why the bounce? So we talked about this a little bit earlier. So I want to kind of take you to your age group turnout, so college students at KU and what we are seeing in terms of pattern. So if we look at this age group breakdown here, you can see that your 18 to 24-year-old age group in 2016 was one of the lowest voting rate group here. So 42%, 48%. As you can see, this was one of the lowest voting age group. And that makes sense. Our research suggests that as individuals grow older, they tend to be more habitual voters, and hence your turnout increases. So younger voters are generally known to vote at lower rates. And we see that here within the university as well. That picture completely changed in 2020. And you can see that 18 to 21-year-olds voted at 69%, which is higher than everyone up to the age of 40 to 49 years of age. So except for 50 years and older students who are enrolled at your institution. So 18 to 24-year-olds really kind of drove the voting rate landscape in KU. And we see that you guys enroll, I was looking at the breakdown here itself, I mean, you guys enroll like 20,000, that close to 20,000 students who are in that age bracket. So, so that's where I think a lot of the bounce is coming from. Those students really motivated and turned out to vote. We know that voting is habit forming, and in 2020, there was a lot of outreach to the younger college student population. So, so these numbers are a reflection of that and all the hard work that's going on campus in reaching the young college students. Again, looking at so kind of reinforcing that point, looking at the undergraduate and graduate breakdown as well. As I was saying, in 2016, undergraduate voting rate for KU was 44%, compared to 54% for graduate students. that completely changed. Undergraduate students voted at 67%, and your graduate students voted at 65%. Still high, but in comparison, undergraduate students voting at higher rates than graduate students is an indication that young college students are really motivated. I wanted to put this plug in. So we're really trying to give you better understanding of what's happening beneath these top line rates that we talk about. In the college student voting landscape, we hear a lot about voting rates, and that's it. We don't actually go further underneath it to see what exactly is happening that's causing these rates to go up, which particular student demographic group is pushing the needle here. For KU, unfortunately, we don't receive these optional data fields, which give better demographic pictures. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we are not able to give you things like race and ethnicity breakdown and gender breakdown because we don't receive that data from KU. So if there are folks on the call who submit data to the National Student Clearinghouse, we really plead you to actually submit these data because we can actually give you a better understanding of what's happening on campus based on that information. So these sets of slides that I put in here, I don't want to go really into the detail here in terms of trends, but this is something else as a resource that we provide that could be a very significant value to folks working on the ground on campuses. Here we're giving you field of study data. So for each student community who are sort of enrolled in these academic disciplines, we provide you voting rate in 2016, voting rate in 2018, and then 2020, and what the change is like. The landscape that you can see here is that there's a lot of big jumps across lots of different fields of study. I wouldn't just focus in on which fields of study had the largest bounce, because there are some fields of study that I noticed in KU, like students in visual and performing arts, a student who do education or public administration, social services, who are already voting at such high rates even before this election. The bounce there seems a lot smaller. So I would focus in on both the rate in voting as well as the change that we're seeing for individuals working directly with these departments and with these academic fields. I think it's an important opportunity to identify these trends and see what's happening, and also shore up on sort of tailoring the curriculum or using teaching as a method to get the students more engaged with our democracy. So the field of study voting rate is a tremendous resource. There's a lot of data here. I'd be happy to go into more detail here, but that's what this particular picture is trying to represent. I'm going to hand now the slides back to, I think, Yui, if you want to go over some of the checklists for campus reports.
Yes, thank you. So for the campus report, and I'm going to go over resources in the later slides, but I know Kate has other recommendations too. So I just want to go over the generalized resources that we put out for campuses. So when you receive these reports, we want you to pay more attention to just the numbers and really analyze them and looking further into the reports. And but I don't know if you mentioned that we also break down voting rates by race and gender, if that is available. And I know currently KU does not provide that data, and that's something that we can work with Kate later to work with the registrar's office to submit that data so we can present it to you to see how your voting rates are broken down by race. So we currently we have 10 different categories of race, Prabhat, that we report on, and then gender. Unfortunately, for the clearinghouse, we only report on female or male currently. So in addition to that, so we want you to focus on read our election imperative series. We have put out 2 so far, I believe. We put out the original one a while back, and we also reissued it or update the version to 2020 during COVID to help campuses navigate how to get their students engaged while they're socially distanced. And we also want you to work with institutional leaders to read and discuss reports to catalyze action. That's why on college campuses, we want usually the president, the director of IR, and one other person receive these reports. So we want these folks to work together to help to understand the reports and how to get the students out there to vote and get them engaged. And also to create and change a coalition responsible for a Voting Plus mandate, to connect voting and with students, political learning discourse, inclusion, and agency and leadership, to train students in the art of political discussion, focus on inclusion, which is what these centers are doing in Kate's office and beyond your campus. And we asked that campuses share these reports, and Kate was saying earlier how they are displayed on the social research office, and then it's also share on the All-In website, which is great. And share the report with faculty across discipline and diverse students groups. Train faculty in session-based teaching. This is relating back to Prabhat's several last slides where we focus on field studies and the importance of getting students to work with faculty members and the administrator, because at the end of the day, faculties do have the most face-to-face with the students. And to identify and focus on students with low voting rates, and convene campus-wide dialogue on the reports and generate a report card, and to bring us in a place to help you get unstuck. So in addition to providing you with resources and your campus report, we also have run workshops. We ran focus groups on college campuses too. Next slide. Thank you. And this is the election imperative 2020 that I just mentioned earlier. And we have recommendations targeted to senior leaders, faculty, academic affairs folks, and in student center organizations and staff members as well. And you can visit, view a copy of that on our website. And this is just additional resources that we've put out throughout the years on our website. And they are all free to college campuses, and in addition to our study, which is free. So we want you to go on there, browse around, look around, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I can put our office emails on there. I am monitoring the email inboxes, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will try my best to answer them or point you to the right direction. Prabhat, do you have any other things to add? I think we're about to wrap up if you have any questions for us as well.
Yeah, the only thing that I wanted to sort of circle back quickly was you mentioned a voting plus mandate. So as you saw earlier when we were outlining our vision, we want democracy to be participatory, but there are other additional facets of democracy that we want to focus in on as well, that is beyond just voting. And for that reason, we oftentimes talk about a voting plus mandate that includes folks on the campus that are not just focused on voting, but the all year-round activity of educating students for democracy. So the election imperative resource that you mentioned earlier is a really good resource if you want to get into that a little bit more. And I see that Kate is scheduled to talk a little bit more about what's going on in KU as well along these lines. So I just wanted to highlight that, and amidst all this talk about voting and turnout, that the real sort of the gist of our work is around democracy beyond just elections.
Can I ask one question just before we move away from the data entirely? The slide that you showed that had the different disciplines and departments and student rates of voting, was that all students or undergraduate students specifically?
Here we include, this is for all students,
Okay.
both undergraduate and graduate students.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that additionally, depending on sort of the ability that we have to identify international students, it may include international students as well as part of the enrolled eligible number here. That's why we call it enrolled here, because it may include international students depending on whether we can identify them or not for KU. So yeah, this should be a comprehensive a list of all your students. These rates are, again, we don't want there to be a competition between departments. That's not the intention in providing these rates. We don't want to be like, hey, education department's doing great, but everyone else is not. So that's not the spirit of providing these rates. So it's actually more for internal assessment than for actually interdepartmental comparison almost of the student engagement that's going on. Really, really powerful data. Our director just loves sort of this particular data because you see that it's at the very end of the report, but it actually is one of the most important pages I think that you have. Thank you for asking the question, Emma.
Yeah, thank you. That is really interesting. And I appreciate what you're saying about the sense of not creating competition, but rather just identifying, the trends that exist already. Thank you.
And sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but I'll go ahead and speak. So Jamila Watson-Thompson with the Center for Service Learning. And this might be somewhat of a related question, but as we look at the field of study, one of our questions were if our multiple campuses are included or if it's just our Lawrence main campus and how we can kind of determine or figure that out. For instance, like particularly our medical center campus and our Edwards campus. So if you maybe could speak to if it's multi-campuses or if there's anything we need to do to ensure that we engage our other campuses.
Yes, that's a really good question. And you and I think both can kind of feel that. So we kind of give the data that comes to us in some respect. And there are different submission practices, Jamila, that campuses have to the National Student Clearinghouse. Some campuses identify their branches in submitting the data, while some campuses don't. They just submit all students under one particular umbrella. I believe in Kansas's case, that's true, that we receive only one sort of umbrella for all students. And that's really our basis of being able to determine who is in what particular school. The field of study data is actually useful in that respect as when National Student Clearinghouse doesn't receive, for example, these are the students from med school, these are the students from the central campus. You can look at this breakdown to get a sense of these different branches that are there. So it's a little bit of a proxy in that way. You can use it. The only caveat there is that if there are cross school courses that are classified under the same area, for example, and these are pretty high level field of study that we give you. There's 8,000 or so classifications actually that's submitted to the clearinghouse. We take the very top level category and bundle students under that category and provide it to you. So I definitely encourage checking with, I think you was noting, the registrar's office, if that's the entity that submits this enrollment data to the clearinghouse, to see how the data is actually submitted. And if these program offerings are pretty consistent to the schools that you're noting, I think field of study is a pretty good proxy for sort of getting a sense of what happens within branches of your institution.
I think that's helpful. And by just a quick look, I'm going to assume it's probably just our main campus. So I will get with those to make, to your point, to see how we submit to the clearinghouse. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, Dr. T, as I just kind of looked up enrollment for each of the campuses, and it would be reporting, like 34,000 something students if we were including Med Center and Edwards in this. So I'm assuming that, like you said, it's just Lawrence campus that's reporting their data.
Thank you, Kate.
Other questions about the data or the report at all?
This time I raised my hand. I was trying to use good practices, but my hand might be blending into my background. So I do have just one other question. Thank you all for this presentation, which is very helpful. And I know you also noted thinking about the range of ways that we can think about engagement in democracy and other practices. Were there resources or tools, or I guess I'm a little bit curious as to any of the promotion points for I guess ways to engage that we might be aligning with what you all have available. I can ask that a different way if it was kind of not clearly put. So what else would you recommend that maybe we do as an institution to think about your other resources or supports through IDHE that will help us to think about, yes, we know voting is a key behavior of interest, but then also the others that we can be systematic with advancing on our campus?
Would you like to take that, or do you want me to sort of go over it?
I guess I don't know. Do you want to start? It's hard when like we're not on campus, so it's hard. Do you have any top of your head recommendation for that?
So I think our intention in putting out election imperatives was to give users sort of like this overarching framework to work with. So that's why I sort of brought up this slide, and we updated this in the 2020 context. And we make recommendations for specific actors that we think on campus that can take these recommendations. So I definitely point you to looking at Election Imperatives 2020 for some principles and for some guidelines there. We do workshops, and actually you can get in touch with Huey, Dr. Thompson, about maybe getting Nancy over and doing a workshop for you guys. She's very well versed in this particular area. This is her wheelhouse. And she'd be happy to come on campus and work with senior leaders, the faculty members, and thinking through recommendations that's been included in election imperatives. And we definitely do offer those workshops.
Yeah, to add to that, the other thing we did, the focus group, what we found was a lot of the campuses were abnormally, sorry, there's like a truck in my background, abnormally high voting rates. They don't shy away from talking about politics, and they really engage the community and the students. And they make the students know that their perspectives and values are valued on campus and valued as human beings and as students, so they don't shy away talking about that and making coming together and creating like a cohesive community. I'm not sure if that was extremely helpful, but that's how we found.
It did. Thank you very much. And yes, it was helpful.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I have a couple of other questions, just kind of moving from talking about KU's data specifically to kind of what you all might have seen kind of on the national landscape as you were putting these reports together. So we've talked about how at this point KU hasn't reported race, ethnicity, gender data, but like I said, that's something that we're working on to the National Student Clearinghouse. But based on national data from institutions that were reporting that data, were there any trends or themes that would be helpful for us to consider, even if our student data wasn't included in that kind of more national landscape?
And that's one of the reasons I'm trying to bring up actually that particular page that we have included in KU's report for you all to look at, because you actually have this information readily as part of the, I'm going to quickly share my screen. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to bring up you guys' report here. And I'll just go over to that page. So this is the page. This actually page, it looks pretty unhelpful, and we were intentionally trying to make you guys give us this data so we can give you the good data back here. These, some of the pictures that we saw, and I'm going to just talk in pretty broad terms here. There were jumps that we noticed in voting rates across student communities, demographic communities here. Well, this data here, picture kind of gives you only just non-intersectional rates. We go into the national report a little bit about what we saw for race and gender student voting rates across. So definitely encourage you to take a look at this page to see what the 2020 landscape overall was like at the national level, but also go to our national report specifically on what that looks like. I think that could be very neatly married with our equity checklist that actually I had mentioned earlier, that's included in the 2020 election imperatives. So I think the national picture combined with the checklist would be a good resource to consult. Yui, do you want to speak to maybe some of the groups that saw higher voting jumps at the national level?
Yeah, I was going to say, throughout the study, we have found that Black women have been consistently voting at higher rates than other groups. And then for this particular year, we saw a jump in Asian students turnout as well. And Prabhat, remind me if it was more Asian females than male who made the bigger jump to that.
I'm going to bring up the national picture here just so that we could really quickly look at the breakdown specifically as well. The EU is noting about student communities that we found. I'm going to give you a quick breakdown here. So this graphic here, this is part of our national report. I'll drop the link in the chat as well. Here we give by intersectional groupings of students some of these jumps that you was noting. So Asian females saw some of the highest jump in voting rates between 2016 and 2020, with almost like 18 points jump, which is one of the highest jumps that we've seen. And then in a group, you can see the comparison in voting rates is all here. We do find that student demographic, again, doesn't give you the complete picture. We see that, you know, white female students tend to vote at one of the highest rates, but that could also be true because they may primarily come from an affluent background. And that we think that SES plays a really important role in motivating students to turn up to vote. So we also don't want you to just look at these numbers and once again, similar to the field of study that I was noting earlier, do intergroup comparisons and come away with the takeaway that here's a group that votes at highest rate, here's a group that votes at lowest rates. And there are a bunch of different factors that are contributing to these turnout patterns, but the changes that we saw are represented here. Now, the change alone doesn't tell you the complete picture. There are some groups, like you were saying, Black women have voted high rates historically as well. So the change that you see in their voting rate is a reflection of that baseline, right? That they didn't see a huge jump because they always tended to vote at higher rates. So want to take that into consideration as well when we're looking at these numbers. But this is kind of the national picture we saw. And I think it'd be a tremendous benefit to KU if you could see the same kind of trend and picture within your university with the data.
Awesome. That is helpful. Another thing that I saw that I thought was really interesting as I was going through report was like voting methods and the ways in which our students were voting. And it seemed like in 2016, the majority of our students, it was like unknown the method they were using to vote, whereas in 2020, it was that unknown portion was much lower, which I thought was really interesting. Is this something that just based on, you know, being in a pandemic, do you think that, you know, what other factors do you think were associated with the method that students were using to vote, or did you see similar sort of structures with other institutions as you were doing this data analysis?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I was planning to include this in my slide, but it's a little bit of a complicated data that we give campuses, so we're happy to help you understand this. You were asking Kate about the national picture here. This is the national picture, kind of what we saw in 2020 was that, and the shading here in outer ring is just trying to show you the national picture in particular. The not in-person voting rate utilization, not in-person utilization, not in-person method of voting utilization was definitely the highest based on the data we have. So of all the voting method data we have, 39% we saw were utilization for students voting using not in-person method. And that could include vote by mail, absentee ballots. It doesn't include early voting, which in itself is a very different flavor of voting, which could be Depending on the state, it could be early in person, or it could also be by mail as well. So we've kind of broken down that separately for you. So that's what the early voting category here is. So yes, 2020, definitely because of just the ease of voting that came with pandemic-related changes to the election administration system. Individuals utilize these alternative methods better, and you can see that jump here. KU specifically, this is a little bit of a complicated data because what we're giving you here is the complete picture across the entire country. So you have students at KU that come from so many different parts of the United States. So they may choose to vote back at their parents' address, let's say. And in that event, they would be utilizing a very different method than voting near campus, let's say. The slightly complicated bit is that not all, so our voter file vendor, L2 Political that I noted earlier, when they source this data from across the entire country, and that's what we were trying to give you as a national picture. Some counties or states just choose not to give vote method data for a variety of reasons, which is what the unknown category here is. It's a little bit kind of beyond the university's control actually here in terms of the data availability. So yeah, in 2016, like 90% of vote method was unavailable. That has changed, and it could be that the county level across Kansas, I think some county officials have started to actually share this data, and we are at, like only at 33% unknown. It could also be that if you have a large proportion of students who are out of state, and students chose to vote at their particular home address, they utilized, their state's vote method, and that's actually available to us from the vendor. So it's a little bit of a tricky voting data to interpret, but we still want you to have that because it gives you some sense of kind of what is happening, and your intuition is spot on there in the sense that the alternative method utilization was higher. And I was noting in particular, I noticed that, so it's a little bit difficult to make a comparison when we have so much unknown in 2016 and in 2018, but just looking at the 2020 picture as a standalone thing instead of looking at change, 24% students actually utilized early vote, which is, I think, it's actually quite a lot. We don't really see that. And actually, incommensurate, actually, in some respect to the, actually, it's a little bit higher than the national picture, which we see only 18% utilized early vote, and you have 24%. So definitely worth understanding what's happening. So, but I wouldn't use it for comparing with the past years, although we've given you change here in addition to the unknown. It's a little bit of a tricky data to sort of parse through. But yeah, not in-person utilization was fairly high as well at 42%, but that's just the nature of 2020 election as well. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you. We have one question in the chat from Emily Ryan, just talking about about heading into another gubernatorial election in Kansas. Are there ways that we can learn from kind of the spike to keep turnout levels up? Obviously, we know that 2016 to 2020 is a big jump, but 2018 to 2022 might look a little bit different since it's not a presidential election. So are there any qualitative components to the data that might help us with that consideration based on kind of the difference of the election type?
I'm sort of thinking about when you say qualitative components, I'm trying to sort of understand what you are asking here. Emily, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. Just and in full disclosure, I haven't read the report, so I don't. But this is me asking. But I think I noted on the numbers that you showed that from 2016 to 2018 there was even an increase in turnout overall, which was kind of surprising because 2018 was not a presidential year, so we did have a governor's race here. So I guess just in noting that it has happened before to go upward from a presidential election to the next election of gubernatorial year. If there's anything that was learned in terms of feedback or things like that as through the surveys, like why more people are voting in 2018 than in 2016 or that kind of thing.
I can take a stab at this and provide feel free to add. And I think that was a result of the 2016 presidential election. The students just got that momentum and they just kept going. So that's why we saw the increase. And I think us and everyone else is kind of afraid that they might lose that momentum with this current administration, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they'll keep moving forward. But that is, I think students were getting out there and they are excited and they understand the impact that they have. And that's also relating to some of the resources that you see on our website is voter suppression. So you look, there was this really great resources on NPR of the number of states are coming out with voter suppression like rules and like laws of like, especially gearing towards college students, because if they see the uptick in college students turnout and the impact that they have. So they're making it harder for college students to vote, like even absentee or having to civic voter ID to vote. Students' IDs are no longer sufficing as a valid form of ID, so they have to get an in-state ID or go home and vote. So that those are the kind of things that we're seeing as a result of college students turning out to vote. So that's why the recommendations that we put out in election imperative 2020, we really geared toward administrator to really step up and push back on these new laws and regulations preventing college students to vote. And there's a good examples that Nancy likes to use is, I think, Tennessee, Prabhat, or New Hampshire, where the governor of New Hampshire came out and said that you cannot use your college students' ID to vote, and you have to get like a valid ID. Or if you are from one area of Tennessee and if you want to vote where you go to school, you have to go all the way home to get like to vote. That was not a very good example because I don't know all the details, but there are just a lot more of these out there. And I was trying to see if I can find an NPR article of the number of states are increasingly making it harder for students to vote.
I may also add here sort of a qualitative component to understand this data better. So going back to this kind of year-to-year comparison across these three metrics that we were talking about earlier, you see the 2018 picture, right? So like, 80% nearly of KU students were registered in 2018. And that was compared to like, let's say 76.7, 77% who were registered. You see that this vessel's kind of like filling up, right? Like, I mean, in 2020, close to 86% of students were registered. Registration tends to stick. A lot of students who were registered in 2020 will most likely stay on the rolls in 2022. But you can see this vessel that we're talking about here in terms of those students that we are registering, how many are actually turning out to vote? So even in 2018, compared to 2016, although it's a presidential, non-presidential election and they have different levels of engagement, there were a lot of students who were registered but didn't end up voting. And that picture is very different in the presidential election years. So I would focus on, I would sort of recommend focusing on that particular student slice that you have on campus who you very successfully were able to, leading up to the election, engage them. But something happened in terms of turning out on the election itself, that they might have encountered what you were saying earlier was either barriers to voting or any kind of suppression, if there is any, that's targeted towards them. That's really, I think, kind of a crucial piece to think about is moving not away from registration, but keeping in mind that registration is an activity that is leading up to the election, but the real action happens on that day of the election. And what are some of the strategies that you can come up with to reach those students, that particular student group here who were successfully on the registration rolls but didn't turn out to vote. There is a group of students, obviously, besides those that were never really engaged, right? So that's what this particular empty part, the null space here is in the 2018 voting rate graphic. Only 45% voted in 2018. So there's a large percentage of students who didn't end up voting. So registration is still important because I think you're going to engage those students. But in tandem to registration, I think talking to students about issues that are on the ballot. So you noted gubernatorial election in 2018 played a crucial role. So in 2022, what are the issues on the ballot? What's at stake? And actually engaging students beyond that voter pipeline and actually talking about why this election matters and what's at stake, I think would definitely add a lot of value to your strategies.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Is there any other questions? I'm happy to just continue yielding anytime I was going to spend talking about things, because I think it's so important that we all have an understanding of what this report is really telling us. So is there any other questions, or does anybody have like just reactions, thoughts about what you've seen, and just kind of any reactions that anyone wants to share? I, for one, can share that when we got this report, and those that were on the Civic Engagement Ambassadors meeting yesterday heard me talk about this. I was driving home to Minnesota when the report came in, and I happened to be at a rest stop in Northern Iowa, and I stopped and I read through the entire thing because we were so excited to get the report. And it was really exciting to see the jump that had been made from 2016 to 2020, and knowing that a lot of it is environmental factors, obviously things that are going on in the country, but I also think it's a validation of a lot of the work that a lot of us are doing and trying to ensure that students have the information they need to be able to make these decisions and feel that they have access to that information. So that was sort of my reflection as I was going through kind of on the positive side. Any other thoughts from anybody else? Any other questions? Comments? And if not, that's okay. I know this was a lot of information, but very, very helpful. Thank you both so much for spending the time with us. I'm going to just really briefly kind of wrap us up. What I will do is send out to everyone who registered today just kind of a follow-up email with some additional resources and information, any links that were shared in the chat I've pulled, and we'll share that in a follow-up email with you all. Some pretty quick and easy things that you might be interested in doing to help support civic engagement work at KU. A lot of you are a part of the Civic Engagement Ambassadors group, but if you're not, we would love to have you. This is a group that, we meet regularly to talk about these kinds of things, and we're in a space now where we're really thinking about what can we do collaboratively to further this work. So if you'd like to be a part of that and you aren't already a part of our group, please feel free to reach out and let us know. We'd be happy to have you. An additional resource that I do want to share that may be helpful to you all or your students or other members of your teams is our Civic Engagement Hub. This is something that we've been working on for a couple of years now, and is something that we're always adding information to hopefully make it a one-stop shop for everything civic engagement at KU, from information about voting, information about our ambassadors program, talking about how do we have conversations about political issues in the classroom. There's a lot of resources on there, and we're always adding new things. So those are two resources I want to leave you all with. Again, I will share more of these things in a follow-up email. This meeting has been recorded, so we will post it in the coming days on the Emily Taylor Center's YouTube channel. So I'll probably wait to do a follow-up email until we have that recording link so that you all will have it too. And if you want to share with any of your colleagues, any of your students that might be interested in viewing the recording along with any of those resources. So any last minute comments, questions? Otherwise, we're just at about time. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we can hang out for a minute, and then if anyone has questions, they can hang on too. But I'll stop the recording, and thank you so much for being here.